At 38,000 feet, both pilots were screaming into the intercom that death was certain. All hydraulics gone, fuel leaking, 341 passengers calling families to say goodbye. Then a dirt-stained farmer in seat 19, Dee stood up and walked toward the cockpit. Nobody knew she had flown 189 combat missions or landed planes that physics said should crash. Nobody knew that beneath those work boots and flannel shirt was a warrior who refused to let anyone die today. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun was just starting to rise over Seattle as Delta Flight 1847 prepared for departure. It was a regular Tuesday morning, and the big Boeing 777 sat at gate N9, ready to fly across America to Atlanta. The plane could hold many people, and today it carried 341 souls, 312 passengers, and 29 crew members. Captain James Bradley walked through his pre-flight checks with calm confidence. At 51 years old, he had been flying for Delta Airlines for 24 years. Next to him sat First Officer David Martinez, 36 years old with 11 years of flying experience. Both were good pilots who had trained well in schools and simulators. Neither had ever been in the military. Neither had ever faced a real emergency where death seemed certain. Seattle Ground Control, Delta 1847, ready for pushback, Captain Bradley said into his radio. His voice was steady and professional. This was just another normal flight, one of thousands he had flown safely. In the back of the plane, in seat 19D, a middle seat in the economy section, sat a woman who looked completely ordinary. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, but everyone called her Maggie. She was 53 years old and owned a wheat and cattle farm in eastern Washington. She looked exactly like what people expected a farmer to look like. Maggie wore an old Carhartt work jacket over a flannel shirt. Her jeans were faded Wranglers with real dirt stains on them. Her work boots were scuffed from years of farm work. She had a John Deere baseball cap on her head, and her hands showed thick calluses from manual labor. She carried a small canvas bag and a thermos of coffee. The businessman in seat 19C barely looked at her. The other businessman in 19, he nodded politely, but then ignored her. To them, she was just a simple farm worker, probably going to some livestock auction. Maybe she didn't travel much. Maybe she wasn't educated. They made these assumptions without thinking about them. The flight attendant spoke to her slowly and clearly when offering drinks, the way people sometimes talk to those they think might not understand well. The young tech workers in row 18 glanced back and whispered jokes about country people. They didn't realize she could hear them. She was invisible to them, not just unnoticed, but actively dismissed as unimportant. What none of them knew was the truth about Maggie Sullivan. Hidden beneath that farmer appearance was Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Sullivan, United States Air Force, retired. She had served 22 years in the military as an A-10 Thunderbolt II pilot, one of the toughest flying jobs in the Air Force. The A-10, nicknamed the Warthog, was a plane built for close air support. It flew low and slow over battlefields, helping soldiers on the ground while enemy forces shot at it from below. Maggie had flown 189 combat missions across 4 deployments. Her call sign had been Reaper, a name she earned by being exceptionally good at her job. When ground troops were under fire and needed help desperately, Reaper Sullivan was the pilot they wanted overhead. She could make the A-10 do things that seemed impossible, flying through intense ground fire to save soldiers who would have died without her. The A-10 was special because it was built to survive damage that would destroy other planes. It could fly with one engine blown apart, with hydraulic systems failed, with half a wing missing. Maggie had personally landed A-10s that were barely flying, using skills and instincts that kept her alive when logic said she should be dead. 7 years ago, she had retired from the Air Force and deliberately chosen a completely different life. She bought a remote farm, learned agriculture, and built a world where nobody knew about her combat past. She suffered from PTSD, the nightmares and memories of combat that many warriors carry home. Farming helped. The quiet land, the growing wheat, the cattle. They asked nothing of her warrior self. Her neighbors knew her as Maggie the wheat farmer, not Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan the combat pilot. That's exactly how she wanted it. She had been a warrior for 22 years. Now she was trying to be something else. As Flight 1847 took off and climbed into morning sky, Maggie deliberately didn't think about flying. She read a farming magazine about wheat prices. She looked out the window at clouds, not at the wing or engines. Farming was her identity now. The warrior was supposed to be in the past. The Boeing 777 crossed the Cascade Mountains and headed east over Idaho and Montana. Passengers settled in for flight. Business travelers opened laptops. Families tried to keep children entertained. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. 2 hours and 10 minutes into the flight, the Boeing 777 was cruising smoothly at 38,000 feet over the Montana wilderness. They were about 180 miles north of Billings, flying over mountains and forests where few people lived. Most passengers were dozing or reading. The flight was perfectly routine. Then, in the tail section of the aircraft, something catastrophic happened. A hydraulic line exploded. The explosion was caused by metal fatigue, a tiny crack that had grown over time until the metal finally gave way under pressure. But this wasn't just one hydraulic line failing. The explosion damaged other lines nearby. Within seconds, the primary hydraulic system was gone. Then the backup system failed. Then the emergency system failed. All three hydraulic systems that should never fail at the same time, were destroyed in a cascading disaster. In the cockpit, warning lights started flashing red. Hydraulic pressure dropping. First Officer Martinez called out, his voice rising. Primary system, 0 pressure. Captain Bradley's hands moved quickly over controls, switching to secondary hydraulics. He waited. Nothing. Secondary system failure. No pressure. Backup system. Martinez said urgently. Backup hydraulics showing 0. All three systems are gone. For a moment, both pilots stared at their instruments in disbelief. What they were seeing was supposed to be impossible. Modern aircraft had 3 separate hydraulic systems specifically, so this could never happen. But it was happening. We have no flight controls, Bradley said, his voice starting to shake. No hydraulics means no control surfaces. The ailerons won't move. The elevators won't move. The rudder won't move. Martinez was already on the radio. Denver Center, Delta 1847. We have complete hydraulic failure. All 3 systems showing 0 pressure. We have lost flight control authority. The Boeing 777 is a fly-by-wire aircraft. When the pilot moves a control stick, computers send signals to hydraulic actuators that move the control surfaces. Without hydraulic pressure, those actuators can't work. The pilot still had engine throttles that worked, but they couldn't steer the plane. They couldn't bank left or right. They couldn't pitch the nose up or down. The plane was still flying level only because it had been trimmed for cruise before the hydraulics failed. Emergency procedures, Bradley said, pulling out the manual with shaking hands. Emergency hydraulic pump. Martinez flipped switches. Emergency pump, not responding. No pressure building. Then the fuel gauges started dropping. Wait, Martinez said, his voice cracking. Fuel quantity decreasing. Both main tanks showing loss. Bradley checked his instruments. The hydraulic explosion must have damaged fuel lines in the tail. We're losing fuel. How fast? Martinez asked, though he was already doing the math in his head. At this rate, maybe 38 minutes before the tanks are empty. The situation had just gone from catastrophic to impossible. They had no flight controls. They were losing fuel. They were over Montana wilderness. The nearest airport with a runway long enough for a 777 was Billings, but they couldn't steer toward it. And even if they could, they'd run out of fuel before getting there. Captain Bradley's professional composure, built over 24 years of safe flying, shattered. His hand reached for the cabin intercom. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer the calm professional captain's voice passengers expect. It was breaking, desperate, filled with tears. This is a captain speaking. His voice cracked. We have a catastrophic hydraulic failure. All three systems. We also have a fuel leak. We cannot control the aircraft. We have maybe 30 minutes before. He stopped, breathing hard. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. There's nothing we can do. We can't. First Officer Martinez was staring at the instruments, his face white. Then he started screaming. Stop. We are already dead. His voice rose to a shriek that carried to the cockpit door. Everyone is already dead. Complete hydraulic failure at this altitude means we're all going to die. There's nothing we can do. Nothing. He kept screaming it over and over. We're dead. We're dead. We're all dead. In the cabin, chaos erupted. Passengers who had been dozing jerked awake. Those who heard the captain's broken announcement and the first officer's screaming started crying immediately. Within seconds, everyone knew something terrible was happening. The screaming spread to the cabin like wildfire. People grabbed their phones to call loved ones and say goodbye. A woman in first class was sobbing, I love you, I love you, I love you, into her phone. The tech workers in row 18 were having panic attacks, hyperventilating into air sickness bags. Children throughout the cabin were screaming in terror, feeding off their parents' fear. The flight attendants tried to maintain calm, but their own faces showed terror. They had heard the pilots essentially announce that everyone was about to die. How do you calm passengers when you believe you have minutes to live? The businessmen on either side of Maggie were openly weeping. One was trying to write something on a piece of paper, a final message to his family. The other had his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. Maggie Sullivan sat in seat 19D, and something was happening inside her. The screaming, the chaos, the announcement of imminent death. It was triggering her PTSD, bringing back memories of combat situations where ground troops she was supporting were about to die. The sounds, the terror, the certainty of death, it was all familiar. But something else was happening, too. Something her therapist had warned her about, but she had never fully understood until now. Her combat training was overriding her panic. While everyone around her was falling apart, her mind was working. The pilot said complete hydraulic failure. They said they couldn't control the aircraft. They said everyone was going to die. But Maggie had flown aircraft with complete hydraulic failure, multiple times, and she had landed them, alive. The A-10 Warthog was designed for exactly this scenario, when hydraulics failed completely, which had happened when ground fire damaged the systems. The A-10 had manual reversion flight controls. The pilot could fly using pure physical force on mechanical linkages, bypassing the hydraulic systems entirely. Modern commercial aircraft didn't have manual reversion because designers assumed the triple redundancy of hydraulics made it unnecessary. But Maggie knew techniques from her A-10 experience that might work anyway. Differential thrust steering. That's what it was called. You use the engines at different power settings to turn the aircraft. If you increase thrust on the left engines and decrease on the right, the plane would turn right because of asymmetric thrust. It was crude, but it worked. She had also used thrust for pitch control. Speed up the engines and the plane pitches down slightly. Slow down and it pitches up. Combined with careful balance, you could fly. Most importantly, she knew something those pilots didn't. You can fly anything if you refuse to give up. The A-10 pilots had a saying, the plane wants to live. Your job was to help it survive, not force it. Maggie unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. The businessman next to her grabbed her arm. Lady, sit down. We're all going to die. She pulled her arm free with surprising strength. Not today. She moved forward to the cabin, pushing past panicking passengers. Her farmer appearance made people assume she was just another terrified passenger until they saw her face. She wasn't panicking. She was moving with purpose, like a soldier moving toward the sound of guns. She reached the cockpit door. A flight attendant was there, tears streaming down her face. Beyond the door, they could hear First Officer Martinez still screaming, We're dead! We're dead! Maggie pounded on the reinforced cockpit door with her fist. Hard, like she was breaching an enemy position. Open this door. I'm former military. I can help. The flight attendant looked at her through tears. Ma'am, the pilots say there's nothing anyone can do. We're all going to die. I'm sorry. Maggie's voice changed. It wasn't a farmer's voice anymore. It was a voice of an officer giving orders in combat. I am Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Sullivan, United States Air Force, retired. I flew A-10 Warthbolt combat aircraft for 22 years. I have landed aircraft with zero hydraulics multiple times. You'll open this door right now, or I will break it down. Do you understand me? The flight attendant hand moved automatically to punch in the emergency code. Military authority, real military authority. Cuts through panic like a knife. The door unlocked. Maggie pushed through. The scene in the cockpit was worse than Maggie had imagined. Captain Bradley was slumped forward in his seat, his head in his hands, openly crying. His shoulders shook with sobs. He had given up completely. First Officer Martinez was rocking back and forth his seat, still screaming, "We're dead, we're dead, we're dead," over and over like a broken recording. His eyes were wide and unfocused. He was having a complete psychological breakdown. Neither pilot was touching controls. Nobody was flying the plane. It was maintaining altitude only because it had been properly trimmed before the hydraulics failed, and the natural stability of the aircraft was keeping it level. But that wouldn't last forever. Maggie grabbed Captain Bradley by both shoulders and physically shook him hard. "Captain, look at me. Look at me." He looked up, his face wet with tears. He saw a farmer woman in dirty work clothes, and his mind couldn't process why she was in his cockpit. "Who, what?" "Listen to me very carefully," Maggie said, her voice hard and clear. "You are not dead. I am Lieutenant Colonel Maggie Sullivan. I flew 189 combat missions in A-10 Warthogs. I have landed aircraft with complete hydraulic failure multiple times. You can control this aircraft using differential thrust. Stop crying and start flying." Bradley stared at her. This couldn't be real. A farmer? A combat pilot? It made no sense. Maggie turned to Martinez, who was still rocking and screaming. She grabbed his face with both hands and forced him to look at her. "First Officer, the throttles still work, correct? Engine controls respond." He stopped screaming for a moment, his training responding even through his panic. He nodded. "Then this aircraft is FOYBLE," Maggie said. "The A-10 can fly with zero hydraulics using thrust steering. Commercial jets use the same physics. I am going to teach you right now how to do it." She positioned herself between the two pilot seats, her farmer appearance completely gone. She stood like a military officer briefing subordinates before a mission. "You have 4 engines total, 2 on each wing. If you increase thrust on the left engines and decrease thrust on the right engines, asymmetric thrust will turn the aircraft right. This is differential thrust steering. It's crude, but it works. I've done it." "Who is flying right now?" Neither pilot answered. Neither was flying. They had both given up. Maggie made a command decision. "Captain Bradley, you are still in command of this aircraft, but you are currently non-functional. First Officer Martinez, I am assuming emergency authority under FAA regulations for incapacitated crew. You're going to follow my instructions exactly. Do you understand?" Martinez nodded slowly. Some part of his pilot training was responding to her command authority. "Put your hands on the throttles," Maggie ordered. "All 4 throttles. Do it now." His hands moved to the throttles, shaking but obeying. "Good. Now listen. The aircraft wants to fly. It's naturally stable. We're not going to force it. We're going to guide it using thrust. Increase the left side engines 1 and 2, to 75% power. Keep the right side, engines 3 and 4, at current power. Execute now." Martinez's hands moved. The left side throttles pushed forward. The right side stayed where they were. For a few seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then the aircraft began to bank slightly to the right. The nose started to turn right. "You see that?" Maggie said. "You just turned the aircraft using only the engines. You have control. Now bring all engines back to equal thrust, and we stop turning." Martinez adjusted the throttles, bringing them all back to the same setting. The aircraft stopped turning. and began to level out. "Congratulations, First Officer," Maggie said. "You just flew without hydraulics. You just did what you thought was impossible." Captain Bradley was watching now. His crying stopped. His mind was starting to work again. Try to understand what was happening. That's not in any manual," he said quietly. "It's not in civilian manuals," Maggie corrected. "It's in military survival flying. When the A-10 gets shot to pieces and hydraulics fail, this is how we bring it home. And it works on any aircraft with multiple engines." She pointed at the fuel gauges. "We have 30-something minutes of fuel left. We need to get this aircraft on the ground. The nearest suitable airport is Billings, Montana, Logan International. It has a runway that's 10,500 feet long. Long enough for us if we do this correctly." Over the next 20 minutes, Maggie taught 2 civilian pilots combat flying techniques they had never imagined existed. "Turning is simple," she explained as Martinez practiced gentle turns left and right. "But you need to be smooth. Small adjustments. The A-10 taught me patience. You can't force anything. You work with the aircraft, not against it." She taught them climb and descent using collective thrust changes. "All engines up together, we climb. All engines down together, we descend. But slowly. Everything is slow and gentle. Aggressive inputs will kill you. Gentle persistence saves you." Captain Bradley was back in his seat now, hands on his controls, practicing what Maggie taught. His professional training was coming back online now that he had hope. "This is like flying a glider," he said. "Energy management." "Exactly," Maggie confirmed. "You're riding the aircraft's natural tendencies, guiding it, not controlling it." She got on the radio with air traffic control in Denver. "Denver Center, Delta 1847. We have restored limited control authority using differential thrust steering. We are setting up for emergency landing at Billings Logan International. We'll need every emergency vehicle you have. We have no hydraulic brakes, no thrust reversers, no steering after touchdown. We're going to land fast and roll on." The controller's voice came back, professional but stunned. "Delta 1847. Confirm your fly with thrust only? No hydraulics." "Confirmed," Maggie said. "I'm a former military pilot assisting the crew. I have experience with this type of emergency." "Roger, 1847. Billings is clearing all traffic. Runway 10 right is 10,500 feet long. Winds are calm. Emergency equipment is rolling." Maggie turned to the pilots. "We're going to talk through this approach step by step. I've landed at 10s with worse damage than this. The key is mental. You have to believe the aircraft wants to survive. Because it does." She explained the landing plan. "We can't use flaps, so we're landing fast. Probably around 190 knots. That's way above normal, but we have no choice. The runway is long enough. We'll have no brakes, so we'll roll the full length and onto the overrun area if needed, but we'll be alive." As they descended toward Billings, Maggie provided continuous guidance. "Stabilize your descent rate. Small thrust adjustments. Don't chase the glide slope. Establish a trend and let it develop. You're not trying to land. You're flying the aircraft toward the runway and letting it settle naturally." "What about the fuel leak?" Martinez asked. "What if we catch fire?" "Then the emergency crews will handle it," Maggie said calmly. "We can only control what we can control. Focus on flying. Trust the process. This works. I've done it." Captain Bradley looked at her. "How many times have you landed with zero hydraulics?" "In combat? 7 times. In training? Dozens. The A-10 is built for this. And this 777 has better glide characteristics than a Warthog. We're going to make it." The approach to Billings Logan International was the longest 20 minutes of anyone's life. In the cabin, passengers could see they were descending. Some had stopped crying, hoping against hope. Others had given up. The flight attendants were in their jump seats, braced for crash landing. In the cockpit, Maggie stood between the 2 pilots, calling out adjustments. "Engines 1 and 2, up 2%. We're drifting right. Good. Hold that. Steady." The aircraft was lined up with runway 10 right. The long black strip of asphalt was visible ahead. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment. Everyone was ready for a crash. "We're too high," Martinez said, his voice tight. "We need to descend faster." "All engines back 3%, Maggie ordered. "Gentle. Let gravity help us. Don't force it." The descent rate increased slightly. The runway was getting closer. "Airspeed 195 knots, Bradley called out. "That's fast." "It's fine," Maggie said. "In the A-10, I've landed at 180 with no flaps and half a wing gone. This is easy by comparison. Stay calm." 1,000 feet above the ground. 500 feet. 200 feet. "Engines idle on my mark," Maggie said. "We want to touch down with minimum thrust." "On mark, now." All four throttles came back. The Boeing 777 was gliding now, its natural stability keeping it steady. The runway was right below them. "Keep the nose up," Maggie coached. "Let it settle. Don't force it down. The plane knows what to do." The main wheels touched the runway with a hard thump. Not graceful, but solid. The nose wheel came down. They were on the ground. Engines are reverse thrust. Bradley started to reach for the reversers. "No." Maggie grabbed his hand. "Reversers need hydraulics. Just keep the engines at idle and let friction slow us." The aircraft was rolling fast down the runway. 195 knots. 180 knots. 160 knots. They passed the midpoint of the runway. Then the three-quarter point. The end was coming up fast. 140 knots. 120 knots. The end of the paved runway flashed past. They rolled onto the overrun area, a section of dirt and gravel designed for exactly this situation. 100 knots. 80 knots. 60 knots. Finally, after rolling nearly 11,300 feet, the entire runway plus 800 feet of overrun, the Boeing 777 stopped. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Captain Bradley's voice came over the intercom, shaking but alive. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're on the ground. We're safe. We're alive." The cabin erupted, not in screams this time, but in cheers and cry and laughter. People were hugging strangers. Grown men were sobbing with relief. Emergency crews rushed to the aircraft, surrounding it with foam in case of fire. But there was no fire, just a battered commercial jet sitting in the dirt, carrying 341 people who had been seconds from death but were now safe. The evacuation was controlled chaos. Passengers slid down emergency slides onto the dirt, many of them kissing the ground. Some couldn't stop crying. Others couldn't stop laughing. Everyone was alive. Federal Aviation Administration investigators arrived within an hour. They gathered in the airport terminal with Captain Bradley and First Officer Martinez, trying to understand what had happened. "Walk me through it again," the lead investigator said. "You had complete hydraulic failure. All three systems." "Yes," Bradley confirmed. "Every backup failed. We had no control surfaces." "And you regained limited control how?" Bradley and Martinez looked at each other. Then Bradley said, "A passenger took command." The investigators looked up from their notes. "A passenger? What do you mean?" "A woman from economy class." Martinez said, "She came into the cockpit. She claimed to be a former military pilot. She taught us differential thrust steering. She talked us through the entire approach and landing." "A passenger taught you how to fly the plane?" The investigator's tone was skeptical. "She didn't teach us how to fly," Bradley said quietly. "She taught us how to survive. We had given up. We were screaming that everyone was dead. She came in and showed us it was possible." "What was this passenger's name?" "Sullivan. Margaret Sullivan. She said she was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, an A-10 pilot." The investigators looked at each other. One pulled out a laptop and started typing. After a minute, his eyes went wide. "Lieutenant Colonel Margaret J. Sullivan, Air Force retired, 22 years of service, A-10 Thunderbolt II pilot, for combat deployments, 189 combat missions." He kept reading, his voice getting quieter. Distinguished Flying Cross, multiple air medals, combat action medal. My God, she's one of the most decorated attack pilots from the recent conflicts. The investigators found Maggie in the terminal, sitting alone with a cup of coffee. She still wore her farmer clothes, still had dirt on her jeans. She looked tired. "Ma'am, we need to interview you about what happened on that flight." She looked up. "I helped the pilots land the plane." "That's all." "That's all?" "Ma'am, you saved 341 lives." She shook her head. "Those pilots saved 341 lives. I just reminded them it was possible. They did the flying." But word was spreading through the terminal. The 341 survivors were learning that the farmer woman, the one many of them had ignored or dismissed, was the person who saved everyone. The tech workers from row 18 found her. Both young men had tears in their eyes. "We made fun of you," one said. "We saw your work clothes and assumed we thought you were just some country person who didn't matter. I'm so sorry. We would be dead if not for you," the other added. "Everyone would be dead." Maggie looked at them. "I'm a farmer. I grow wheat and raise cattle. I'm also a pilot who flew combat missions. People contain multitudes. Never assume you know someone's full story just by looking at them." The businessman who had sat next to her in 19C approached. "I didn't even really see you on the plane. You were invisible to me. I'm ashamed and grateful. So grateful." More passengers came. A mother with 2 children who were alive because of her. An elderly couple holding hands. A young woman who had been calling her parents to say goodbye. All alive. The news media descended on Billings within hours. The story was too good to ignore. Commercial pilots screamed that everyone is dead, and a farmer from economy class saves a plane using combat flying techniques. Maggie refused most interviews. She gave one brief statement. "The pilots face an impossible situation. I had training they didn't have. I was glad to help. That's all." But investigators were studying the wreckage of Flight 1847, and what they found was troubling. The hydraulic explosion had been caused by maintenance failure, a crack that should have been caught during inspection, but wasn't. The cascading failure was a result of design oversight. Pipes routed too close together, so one explosion damaged all systems. More troubling was the psychological evaluation of Captain Bradley and First Officer Martinez. Both experienced pilots had completely collapsed under pressure. They had screamed that everyone was dead while a solution existed. Their training had never prepared them for a genuine no-hope scenario. Civilian flight training is excellent for normal operations, the FAA evaluator wrote in his report. But these pilots had no mental framework for survival in impossible circumstances. They gave up immediately. Only the intervention of a military combat pilot with experience flying damaged aircraft saved the situation. The report recommended changes to pilot training, including scenarios where all normal procedures fail and creativity becomes essential. Delta Airlines called Maggie 3 days later. "We want to hire you as a consultant," the executive said, "to develop emergency training programs, to teach commercial pilots survival flying techniques." "I'm a farmer," Maggie said. "I grow wheat." "You're also a combat pilot who saved 341 lives. Please consider it." The Air Force called too. "We need you to teach a course on battle damage, flying for commercial aviation. The airlines are requesting it." "I'm retired," she said. "I left that life behind." Back on her farm in eastern Washington, Maggie tried to return to normal. She checked her wheat fields. She fed her cattle. She fixed a fence that had been broken. Everything should have been the same. But her neighbors looked at her differently now. "Is it true you saved that plane?" they asked. "Our Maggie? You were a fighter pilot." The revelation that quiet farmers might carry extraordinary hidden expertise changed how they saw her. She wasn't just Maggie who grew wheat anymore. She was Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, who flew combat missions and saved 341 lives. She found herself standing in her field one evening, watching the sunset over the wheat. She had spent 7 years trying to separate herself from her military identity. 7 years building a life where she was just a farmer. 7 years avoiding the warrior she had been. But in that cockpit, with those pilots screaming that death was certain, her training had taken over, not reluctantly, not with hesitation. Instantly and completely. She had been a warrior again, and it had felt natural. Her therapist had warned her, "You can't erase 22 years of training. You can't undo who you were. You can only integrate it with who you're becoming." Maybe that was a lesson. She didn't have to choose between farmer and pilot. She could be both. A person could contain multitudes. 2 months after the emergency landing, Captain Bradley and First Officer Martinez were still flying, but both were in counseling. They had to process their psychological collapse, their certainty of death, their complete surrender. "I thought I was a good pilot," Bradley told his therapist. "I had thousands of hours, perfect safety record. But when it really mattered, I fell apart. I gave up. I was crying while my passengers needed me to be strong." "You face a situation your training never prepared you for," the therapist said. "Civilian flight training doesn't include combat survival psychology. You didn't fail. You encountered something beyond your experience." Martinez had similar struggles. "I kept screaming, 'We're dead,' over and over. Everyone could hear me. I traumatized people before they even knew what was happening. And I was wrong. We weren't dead. Colonel Sullivan knew we weren't dead. Why did I give up so easily?" Both pilots requested to meet with Maggie. She agreed and flew to Atlanta, where Delta was based. They met in a quiet conference room. Both pilots looked uncomfortable. "We wanted to thank you," Bradley started. "You saved our lives. You saved everyone." "You flew the plane," Maggie corrected. "I just taught you techniques you didn't know." "We wanted to understand," Martinez said. "How did you not panic? We're trained pilots, and we fell apart. You're a farmer, and you stayed calm." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "I'm not just a farmer. I'm a combat pilot with 22 years of training. I've been in situations where death seemed certain multiple times. The A-10 is designed to get shot to pieces and keep flying. I brought planes home that were barely planes anymore." She looked at both of them. "You fell apart because your training says complete hydraulic failure means certain death. My training says complete hydraulic failure means get creative. It's a different mindset. Neither is wrong. You just haven't been taught what to do when impossible happens." "Could you teach us?" Bradley asked. "Could you teach other pilots?" That was the question that had been following her for 2 months. Delta wanted her as a consultant. The Air Force wanted her to develop a curriculum. Other airlines were calling. Everyone wanted her expertise. "I left the military to get away from that life," she said. "I have PTSD, combat memories. The farm helps me heal. Teaching combat flying might pull me back into the world I'm trying to leave behind. But think about all the pilots who might face what we faced," Martinez said. "Think about all the passengers whose lives might depend on pilots knowing what you know. If you don't teach it, who will?" He was right, and she knew it. The FAA was already recommending changes to training based on Flight 1847. But recommendations without expertise were just words. Maggie returned to her farm and spent a week thinking. She walked her fields. She sat with her cattle. She did the quiet work of farming that had brought her peace for 7 years. But she also thought about those 341 people who were alive because she hadn't given up. She thought about other pilots who might face impossible situations without knowing there were options beyond surrender. She called Delta Airlines back. "I'll do consulting work," she said, "but only part-time. I'm still a farmer. That doesn't change." "We'll take whatever you can give us," the executive said. She also called the Air Force. "I'll develop your curriculum. But I'm teaching survival flying, not combat flying. There's a difference. Survival is about bringing people home alive, not destroying the enemy." Over the next 6 months, Maggie developed a training program called Survival Flying for Commercial Pilots. She taught it 3 times a year at various airline training facilities. The rest of the time, she was back on her farm. The course covered scenarios that traditional training ignored. What to do when all backup systems fail simultaneously, differential thrust steering techniques flying with partial or complete loss of control, surfaces the psychology of refusing to accept death-creative problem solving under impossible pressure. Most importantly, she taught mindset. Your plane wants to survive, she told each class. Your job is to help it. Never give up. There's always something you can try. Pilots from around the world came to learn from her. They arrived expecting a stern military officer and found a woman in farm clothes who spoke plainly and calmly. She taught using real stories from her combat experience, explaining how she kept flying when logic said the plane should fall from the sky. Captain Bradley and First Officer Martinez became instructors too, teaching the psychological aspects. We failed mentally before we failed physically, Bradley told the classes. We accepted death too quickly. Don't make our mistake. The FAA made her training mandatory for all commercial pilots within 2 years. Airlines changed their procedures. Aircraft manufacturers started designing planes with manual reversion controls again, inspired by the A-10 survival features. 3 years after Flight 1847, another aircraft had a similar emergency, a China Airlines flight with double hydraulic failure over the Pacific. The pilots used differential thrust steering techniques they'd learned from Maggie's course. They landed safely. All 287 people survived. The pilot called Maggie afterward. I was in your class 6 months ago. When the hydraulics failed, I heard your voice in my head. The plane wants to survive. Thank you for teaching me not to give up. More incidents followed. A British Airways flight with severe control damage. A United flight with engine separation that damaged hydraulic lines. A Qantas flight with electrical failure affecting flight controls. Pilots trained in Maggie's techniques saved them all. She kept a list on her refrigerator at home. Tally marks for lives saved using her training. After 5 years, the count was over 2,000 people who were alive because pilots knew survival flying techniques. 7 years after Flight 1847, Maggie was teaching a class at Delta's training facility in Atlanta. The students were experienced pilots, most with over 10,000 flight hours. They sat respectfully while this woman in jeans and a flannel shirt explained combat flying. The A-10 has a saying, she told them. Low, slow, and full of holes. That's how we fly close air support. We accept that we're going to get hit. We design for survival, not for avoiding damage. Commercial aviation is the opposite. You design to avoid problems. But when impossible happens, you need the A-10 mindset. She pulled up a video of an A-10 landing with one engine destroyed, half the tail missing, and hydraulics failed. The plane looked like it shouldn't be able to fly at all, but it touched down safely. That pilot refused to eject, Maggie explained. The plane was over city. If he ejected, the plane would crash into buildings. So he wrote it down using techniques I'm teaching you today. The plane was totaled, but the pilot walked away. More importantly, nobody on the ground died. A young pilot raised his hand. Ma'am, how do you develop that refusal to quit? How do you keep fighting when everything says you should give up? Maggie thought about the question. You practice it. In combat, you develop it through experience. In civilian flying, you develop it through training and mindset. You tell yourself before every flight, if something goes wrong, I will not give up. I will try everything. I will bring my passengers home. She paused. And you remember that passengers trust you with their lives. When Captain Bradley and First Officer Martinez were screaming that we were dead, 341 people heard it. They accepted death because their pilots accepted death. Your mental state affects everyone on that plane. After class, several pilots came to thank her. One older captain said, I've been flying for 30 years. I thought I knew everything. You taught me I was wrong. Thank you. Maggie drove back to her farm that evening. The wheat was ready for harvest. She'd need to start combining tomorrow. Her cattle needed feeding. The fence in the south pasture still needed repair. She was a farmer. She was also a teacher. She was also a retired combat pilot. She was all of these things, and that was okay. Her therapist had been right. You couldn't erase who you were. You could only integrate it. The warrior and the farmer weren't separate people. They were both Maggie Sullivan. 10 years after Flight 1847, Maggie received a letter from the FAA. They were awarding her the Laura Tabor Barber Air Safety Award, the highest civilian honor for contributions to aviation safety. The ceremony was in Washington, D.C. Maggie almost didn't go. She hated formal events and didn't like being the center of attention. But the FAA administrator personally called her. "You've saved thousands of lives through your training program," he said. "You need to be recognized. Besides, many of those people will be there. They want to thank you." The ceremony was held in a large hotel ballroom. When Maggie arrived in her best dress, still fairly simple, she was shocked to see the crowd. Hundreds of people were there. Captain Bradley and First Officer Martinez were there with their families. The 341 survivors from Flight 1847 had been invited, and many had come. Pilots she'd trained, passengers from aircraft those pilots had saved, family members of people who were alive because of her training. The FAA administrator gave the opening speech. 10 years ago, a Boeing 777 experienced catastrophic hydraulic failure over Montana. 2 experienced pilots believed everyone was dead, but a passenger, a farmer from eastern Washington, entered the cockpit and taught them combat flying techniques that saved 341 lives. He continued, "Since then, Colonel Sullivan has trained over 15,000 commercial pilots in survival flying techniques. Her methods have been used in 18 major emergencies, saving over 3,000 lives. She has fundamentally changed how we think about aviation safety." When Maggie walked onto the stage to receive her award, the entire room stood and applauded. The applause went on for 5 minutes. People were crying. She accepted the award, a beautiful glass sculpture, and was supposed to give a speech. She looked out at all those faces. Pilots she'd trained. Passengers who were alive because those pilots hadn't given up. "I'm not good at speeches," she said simply. "I'm a farmer. I grow wheat. I also used to fly at 10s in combat. I learned something in the A-10 that I think everyone should know. Don't give up, ever. The plane wants to survive. Your job is to help it. That's all I teach. Don't give up." She paused. When I heard those pilots screaming that we were dead, I knew they were wrong. Not because I'm smarter or braver, but because I'd been trained differently. I'd learned that impossible just means you haven't figured it out yet. That's what I try to pass on. More applause. Then people started coming up to share their stories. A woman in her 30s. "I was 6 years old on Flight 1847. I'm alive because of you. I'm a pilot now because of you. Thank you." A man with gray hair. "I was on that China Airlines flight over the Pacific. Our pilot used your techniques. My grandchildren exist because you taught him not to give up." An airline captain. "I took your class 3 years ago. Last year, I had a control failure. I used differential thrust steering. Everyone lived. I think about you every time I fly." The stories went on for hours. Each one was a life saved, a family kept together, a future that existed because Maggie had taught someone to refuse death. Maggie returned to her farm after the ceremony. The wheat needed harvesting. Life went on, but things had changed. Her training program was now taught internationally. The techniques she developed were in every airline's emergency procedures manual. Aircraft manufacturers were designing new planes with her input, adding systems that would allow manual control even if computers failed. The Air Force asked her to come back for one final mission, not to fly, but to speak to young A-10 pilots about the importance of their training. She agreed. Standing in front of a room full of young pilots at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, she felt strange. She hadn't been on a military base in years. These pilots were so young, the same age she'd been when she started flying the Warthog. "You're learning to fly the toughest aircraft in the military," she told them. "The A-10 is designed to take damage and keep flying. But the real lesson isn't about the plane. It's about you." She explained Flight 1847, how civilian pilots with thousands of hours of experience gave up immediately when faced with a situation their training hadn't covered. "You're learning more than flying," she said. "You're learning survival. You're learning to refuse defeat. You're learning that impossible is just a word." Those lessons saved my life in combat. They saved 341 civilians in a commercial jet. They've saved thousands more since then. She looked at their young faces. Some of you will stay in the military your whole career. Some will leave and become civilian pilots or farmers or teachers. Whatever you do, remember what the A-10 teaches. Don't give up. Keep fighting. Bring everyone home. After her speech, a young female pilot approached. Ma'am, I want to be like you. Combat pilot who makes a difference. Maggie smiled. You already are making a difference. Every mission you fly, every soldier you protect. But remember, your service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. The skills you learn here, the mindset you develop, you carry them forever. Use them to help people. That's the real mission. 15 years after Flight 1847, Maggie was 68 years old. She still ran her farm, though she'd hired help for the heavy work. She still taught her survival flying course twice a year. She still carried both identities, farmer and warrior, comfortably integrated. Her PTSD had improved significantly. The nightmares were rare now. Farming had healed her, and ironically, teaching combat flying techniques to save lives had also helped. She'd taken her warrior skills and transformed them into something that created life instead of dealing death. One spring morning, she was checking her wheat fields when a car pulled up. A young woman got out, maybe 30 years old, professional-looking with a small child. Are you Colonel Sullivan? The woman asked. I'm Maggie Sullivan, she replied. Can I help you? I was on Flight 1847, the woman said. I was 12 years old. I was traveling alone to visit my dad in Atlanta. When the pilots said we were going to die, I thought my life was over before it really started. Tears filled her eyes. But you saved us. You saved me. I grew up, went to college, became a teacher, got married, had this beautiful daughter. None of that would have happened if you hadn't known what to do. She gestured to her daughter. I named her Margaret, after you. I wanted her to carry the name of the person who gave me a future. Maggie felt her own eyes filling with tears. This was why she'd come back to teaching. Not for awards or recognition, but for moments like this. Lives lived, futures created, children born because their parents survived. Thank you for telling me, Maggie said. It means more than you know. After they left, Maggie stood in her wheat field for a long time. The wheat swayed in the wind, peaceful and alive. Her cattle grazed in the distance. The farm was quiet and calm. But she wasn't just a farmer. She was also the person who'd refused to let 341 people die. She was the person who'd taught thousands of pilots to refuse death. She was the reason little Margaret existed. She had spent years trying to choose between warrior and farmer, between her military past and her civilian present. But the truth was simpler. She was both. She had always been both. The warrior in her had saved lives. The farmer in her had found peace. Both were essential. Both were real. 20 years after Flight 1847, the aviation world gathered to celebrate the anniversary. The incident was now taught in every aviation school as a case study in creative problem-solving and survival mindset. Captain Bradley, now retired, gave a speech. I failed that day, he said honestly. I gave up. I accepted death. I was the captain responsible for 341 lives, and I fell apart. If not for Colonel Sullivan, everyone would have died because I wasn't mentally strong enough. He paused. But she taught me something that changed my last 10 years of flying. She taught me that giving up is a choice. Panic is a choice. You can choose to keep fighting instead. I flew for 10 more years after that incident, and I never forgot. No matter how bad it looks, keep trying. Don't give up. First Officer Martinez, also retired, added, We dismissed her on sight, a farmer woman in dirty work clothes. We assumed she had nothing to offer, but she was the most qualified person on that aircraft. We learned 2 lessons that day. Technical, how to fly with thrust only, and human, never assume you know someone's value by their appearance. Maggie, now 73, stood to speak. Her hair was white, her face deeply lined, but her eyes were still sharp and clear. 20 years ago, I was trying to run away from my past, she said. I'd been a warrior, and I wanted to be just a farmer. I thought I had to choose. But that emergency taught me something. You don't have to choose. You can be many things. You can integrate all your experiences into one complete person. She smiled. I'm a farmer. I love my land, my wheat, my cattle. I'm also a retired combat pilot. I love flying, survival, teaching others. Both are real. Both are me. And when those pilots needed help, both parts of me were ready. She concluded, life is long and complicated. You'll be many different things. Don't try to erase your past to create your future. Integrate it. Use everything you've learned, everything you've been, to help others. That's how we honor all the versions of ourselves. The standing ovation lasted 10 minutes. After the ceremony, Maggie drove home to her farm in eastern Washington. The wheat was growing green and strong. Her cattle were healthy. The land was peaceful. She was Maggie Sullivan, farmer, warrior, teacher, survivor. She had lived 189 combat missions and saved over 3,000 lives through her training. She had grown countless tons of wheat and raised hundreds of cattle. She had integrated the warrior and the farmer into one complete person. As the sun set over her fields, she felt at peace. She had spent years trying to escape her warrior past. But in the end, that warrior had saved hundreds of lives in ways combat never could. Both the warrior and the farmer had purpose. Both had value. She was whole, finally completely whole. And somewhere on a commercial flight crossing America, a pilot faced a minor emergency and remembered Maggie's words. The plane wants to survive. Your job is to help it. Don't give up. The emergency was resolved safely. Everyone landed alive. And Maggie's legacy continued, saving lives one flight at a time, one pilot at a time, one moment of refusing to surrender at a time. The farmer who was also a warrior, the warrior who became a teacher, the woman who proved that people contain multitudes, and that every experience, even the painful ones, can be transformed into something that saves lives.